Okay, Eli and Vinny, we're on to chapter 4, Mr. Badger. Let's go. They waited patiently for what seemed a very long time, stamping in the snow to keep their feet warm. At last they heard a sound of a slow, shuffling footstep approaching the door from the inside. It seemed as if the mole remarked to the rat, like someone walking in carpet slippers that were too large for him, and down at heel, which was intelligent of mole, because that's exactly what it was. There was a noise of a bolt shot back, and the door opened a few inches, enough to show a long snout and a pit of sleepy blinking eyes. "Now, the very next time this happens," said a gruff and suspicious voice, "I shall be exceedingly angry." "Who is it this time, disturbing people on such a night? Speak up." "Oh, Badger," cried the rat, "let us in, please. It's me, Rat, and my friend Mole, and we've lost our way in the snow." "What, Ratty, my dear little man?" exclaimed the Badger in quite a different voice. "Come along in, both of you, at once. Why, you must be perished. Well, I never. Lost in the snow. And in the wild wood, too? At this time of night? But come with you." The two animals tumbled over each other into their eagerness to get inside, and heard the door shut behind them with great joy and relief. The two animals tumbled The Badger, who wore a long dressing gown and whose slippers were indeed very down at heel, carried a flat candlestick in his paw, and probably been on his way to bed when their summons sounded. He looked kindly down on them and patted both of their heads. "This is not the sort of night for small animals to be out," he said paternally. "I'm afraid you've been up to some of your pranks again, Ratty. But come along, come into the kitchen. There's a first-rate fire there, and supper and everything." He shuffled on in front of them, carrying the light, and they followed him, nudging each other in the anticipating sort of way, down a long, gloomy, and, to tell the truth, decidedly shabby passage into a sort of a central hall, out of which they could dimly see others tunnel-like passages branching, passages mysteriously and without apparent end. But there were doors in the hall as well, stout, oaken, comfortable-looking doors. One of these the Badger flung open, and at once they found themselves in the glow and warmth of a large fire-lit kitchen. The floor was well-worn red brick, and the wide hearth burnt a fire of logs between two attractive chimney corners tucked away in the wall, well out of any suspicion of draught. A couple of high-backed settles, facing each other on each side of the fire, gave further sitting accommodations for the sociably disposed. In the middle of the room stood a long table of plain boards, placed on trestles, with benches down each side. At one end of it there was an armchair stood pushed back, where spread the remains of Badger's plain and ample supper. Rows of spotless plates winked from the shelves of the dresser at the far end of the room. From the rafters overhead hung hams, bundles of dry herbs, nets of onions, and baskets of eggs. It seemed a place where heroes could fitly feast after victory, where weary harvesters would come line up in scores along the table and keep their harvest home with mirth and song, or where 2 or 3 friends of simple taste could sit about as they pleased and eat and smoke in comfort and contentment. The ruddy brick floor smiled up at the smoky ceiling. The oaken settles, shiny with long wear, exchanged cheerful glances with each other. Plates on the dresser grinned at pots on the shelf, and the merry firelight flickered and played over everything without distinction. The kindly Badger thrust them down on a settle to toast themselves by the fire, and bade them remove their wet coats and boots. Then he fetched them dressing gowns and slippers, and himself bathed the mole's shin with warm water and mended the cut with sticking plaster till the whole thing was just as good as new, if not better. In the embracing light and the warmth, warm and dry at last, with weary legs propped up in front of them, the suggestive clink of plates were arranged on the table behind. It seemed to be the storm-driven animals, now in safe anchorage, that the cold and tactless wild wood just left outside for miles and miles away, and all that had suffered in a half-forgotten dream. When at last they were thoroughly toasted, the badgers summoned them to the table where they had been busy laying a repast. They had felt pretty hungry before, but when they actually saw at last the supper that was spread for them, really it seemed only a question of what they should attack first. Were all so attractive, and whether the other things would obligingly wait for them till they had time to give their attention. Conversation was impossible for a long time, and when it slowly resumed, it was a regrettable sort of conversation that results from talking with your mouth full. The badger did not mind that sort of thing at all, nor did he take any notice of elbows on the table, or everybody speaking at once. As he did not go into society himself, he had got an idea of these things belonged to the things that didn't really matter. We know, of course, that he was wrong and took too narrow a view, because they do matter very much, though it would take too long to explain why. He sat in his armchair on the head of the table and nodded gravely at intervals as the animals told their stories, and he did not seem surprised or shocked at anything, and he never said, "I told you so," or "just what I always said," or remarked that they ought to have done so and so, or ought to not have done something else. The mole began to feel very friendly towards him. When supper was really finished at last, and each animal felt that his skin was now as tight as was decently safe, and that by the time he didn't care a hang for anybody or anything, they gathered round the glowing embers of the great wood fire. There they are. And thought how jolly it was to be sitting up so late and so independent and so full. And after that they had chatted for a time about things in general, and Badger said heartily, "Now then, tell us the news from your part of the world. How's old Toad going on?" "Oh, from bad to worse," said the rat gravely, while the mole cocked up on the settle and, basking in the firelight, his heels higher than his head, tried to look properly mournful. "Another smash-up only last week, and a bad one. You see, he will insist on driving himself, and he hopelessly is incapable. If he'd only employ a decent, steady, well-trained animal, pay him good wages, and leave everything to him, he'd get on all right. But no, he's convinced he's a heaven-born driver, and nobody can teach him anything, and all the rest that follows." "How many has he had?" inquired the badger gloomily. "Smashes or machines?" asked the rat. "Oh, well, after all, it's the same thing with Toad. This is the 7th. As for the others, you know that couch house of his. Well, it's piled up, literally piled up to the roof with fragments of motor cars, none of them bigger than your hat. That accounts for the other 6. So far as we can account for. He's been to the hospital 3 times, put in the mole. And as for the fines he's had to pay, it's simply awful to think of." "Yes, and that's the part of the trouble," continued the rat. "Toad's rich, we all know, but he's not a millionaire, and he's hopelessly bad driver, and quite regardless of the law and order. Killed or ruined, it's got to be one of the 2 things, sooner or later, Badger. We're his friends. Ought we do something?" The badger went through a bit of hard thinking. "Now look here," he said at last, rather severely. "Of course you know I can't do anything now." His 2 friends assented, quite understanding his point. No animal, according to the rules of animal etiquette, is ever expected to do anything strenuous or heroic or even moderately active during the off-season of winter. All are sleepy, some actually asleep. All are weather-bound, more or less, and all are resting from arduous days and nights during which every muscle in them has been severely tested and every energy kept at full stretch. "Very well, then," continued the badger, "but when once the year has really turned and the nights are shortest, and halfway through them one rouses and feels fidgety and wanting to be up and doing by sunrise, it's not before, you know." Both animals nodded gravely. "They knew!" "Well, then," went on the badger, That is, you and I and our friend the mole here, will take Toad seriously in hand. We'll stand no nonsense whatsoever. We'll bring him back to reason by force if need be. We'll make him be a sensible Toad. Well, you're asleep, Rat. Not me, said Rat, waking up with a jerk. He's been sleeping 2 or 3 times since supper, said the mole laughingly. He himself was feeling quite wakeful and even lively, though he didn't know why. The reason was, of course, that he was being naturally or underground animal by birth and breeding. The situation of Badger's house exactly suited him and made him feel at home. While the Rat, who slept every night in a bedroom, the windows of which opened to a breezy river, naturally felt the atmosphere still and impressive. Well, it's time we're all to bed, said the Badger, getting up and fetching his candlesticks. Come along, you two, and I'll show you your quarters. And take your time tomorrow morning. Breakfast at any hour you please. He conducted the 2 animals to a long room that seemed half bedchamber and half loft. The Badger's winter stores, which indeed were visible everywhere, took up half of the room. Piles of apples, turnips, potatoes, baskets full of nuts, jars of honey, but the 2 little white beds on the remainder of the floor looked soft and inviting, and the linen on them, though coarse, was clean and smelt beautifully of lavender. And the mole and the water rat, shaking off their garments in some 30 seconds, tumbled in between the sheets in great joy and contentment. And in accordance with the kindly Badger's injunctions, the 2 tired animals came down to breakfast very late the next morning, and found a bright fire burning in the kitchen, and 2 young hedgehogs sitting on a bench at the table, eating oatmeal porridge out of wooden bowls. The hedgehogs dropped their spoons, rose to their feet, and ducked their heads respectfully as they entered. I think this might be a good time. We'll read tomorrow about the hedgehogs. Love you, sweetheart. Mwah!